Last week we started in chapter 33 of Isaiah. The first 6 verses is a prayer of praise for what God will do. The historical background of this or situation is that ambassadors who were sent by Hezekiah with tribute of 30 talents of gold and 300 talents of silver to Sennacherib. Sennacherib was at Lachish at the time, returned home with the news that Assyria took the tribute money, but they would not abandon the siege. So they were dealing treacherously with them. And so thus we enter into what is the 5th woe in this series. In verse 1, woe to thee that spoilest, and thou wast not spoiled, and dealest treacherously, and they dealt not treacherously with thee. When thou shalt cease to spoil, thou shalt be spoiled. And when thou makest an end to deal treacherously, they shall deal treacherously with thee. And then the plea to God, O Lord, be gracious unto us. We have waited for thee. Be thou their arm every morning, our salvation also in time of trouble. Last week, as we were discussing verse 1, I read a quote from Terry Hightower. I misread it. I don't know, how you can do that. But Terry had written, everything was one-sided in the relations between Assyria and Judah. Assyria was doing all the, and I said talking. Actually, what was written is taking. Assyria was doing all the taking and Judah all the giving. And that is the situation. Assyria was taking all of this tribute money, giving nothing to Judah. Judah was the one who was giving all of the tribute, all of the money, everything that they had, basically, to Sennacherib, and Sennacherib takes it and says, I don't care what you gave, we're still going to put you under siege and keep the siege on you and continue to destroy you. Thus the dealing treacherously. That's what Sennacherib did. Honesty, if Sennacherib was going to keep the siege upon Jerusalem, honesty would have demanded he say, no, I won't take the money. I won't take the tribute. But he took it and kept the siege on anyway. If he was going to take the money, the tribute, he should have withdrawn the siege. That would have been dealing right. But he doesn't do that. He dealt treacherously with them.
That basically suggests that he meant to go ahead and make them suffer and kill them anyway, even though they give him all that money. He didn't care. He's going to still assault them anyway.
Yes.
With full violence and full assault methodology.
Yes, he was still going to destroy them, even though he took the money. We would look at a situation likened to that today, and we would be thinking how evil that is. Sennacherib was king. He could do whatever he wanted to. It wasn't right. It was dealing treacherously, and thus the punishment that God meted out upon him.
Didn't Hitler do the same thing, basically? Hitler and Mussolini? I don't know.
I don't know of them taking tribute likened to that. I mean, what they did was evil, but I'm not sure that it would be parallel to what Sennacherib was doing. So that brings us to verse 3. At the noise of the tumult, the people fled. At the lifting up of thyself, the nations were scattered. Yahweh's approach is going to cause the people to flee. The noise of the tumult here is in reality the voice of Yahweh. Someone read Isaiah chapter 30 and verses 30 and 31 for us. Okay, if you look at this, here's the glorious voice of the Lord. It's going to be heard. But then notice the descriptions that he uses. Lightning down his arm with the indignation of his anger. Flame of devouring fire. Scattering, tempest, hailstones. Here it's all summed up with the noise of the tumult. And so this is describing God's approach and his lifting up himself in a figurative sense for action. In other words, he is getting ready to act upon them. And that causes the nations to flee. Have you ever seen even animals? Sometimes you get a big animal and this little animal is just picking at him all the time, and all of a sudden the bigger animal gets up and off goes that little one scatters. That's kind of like what we're saying here. All of a sudden, God raises up to act. And what happens? The nations flee. They're scattered. Sennacherib's army was in reality made up of many nations. It was not just the Assyrians. He would incorporate the best of the best nations or soldiers from other nations into his army. So thus he can use, or Isaiah can use here, the nations, plural, were scattered because Sennacherib's army was made up of many nations, not just the Assyrians. It could be that. And talking about the time in which God actually acted in regards to the Assyrians and killing the 185,000 soldiers. And certainly Sennacherib's army fled then. They got out of town as quickly as they could. And it would have been the voice of Yahweh at that time. Yes, absolutely. That he had been provoked to action at that time, and thus still the nations scattered. They just went all sorts of different ways. In verse 4, then, he says, "And your spoil shall be gathered like the gathering of the caterpillar. As to the running to and fro of locusts shall he run upon them." There are certain animals that, well, like the locust, the caterpillar that's mentioned here, that destroy everything. We would remember in the 10 plagues. Basically, you have certain animals like the locusts that destroyed all of the crops, everything that was there. They ate up everything.
Joel has a good description in chapter 1 and 2, too.
Joel uses the same figure to demonstrate or to show the destructive nature of them, that they destroy everything. Well, here Isaiah is using this, that Yahweh is going to destroy his enemies. So just like the animals, those locusts and caterpillars destroyed Egypt, they destroyed those nations, and that Joel is talking about, well, God's going to destroy his enemies like that. And all of their spoil is going to be gathered by others. The caterpillar would be the developmental stage of the locust, and they are very destructive. The spoil of the Assyrians. Your spoil shall be gathered like the gathering of the caterpillar. Well, the soil of the Assyrians would have been that which they have taken from all of these nations that they've defeated. They had come in a southern type of movement, coming from Assyria and coming down into Palestine and defeating all of the nations in Palestine, including the northern kingdom. They were continuing, or what they were planning on doing, is continuing down Palestine. They were over by the Mediterranean Sea primarily when Rabshakeh is sent with his message, and they had plans of going down into Egypt and destroying Egypt as well. So they've collected all of this spoil from all of these nations that they've destroyed. And now then it's going to be taken by others. Well, that would certainly harmonize with the 185,000 soldiers who died in that one night. And I won't use that phrase, they woke up dead. Pulpit commentary stated about this that in the historical narrative, which is 2 Kings 19:35 and Isaiah 37:36, nothing is said about it. But beyond a doubt, when the host was to a large extent destroyed and the remainder fled, there must have been an enormous booty left behind, which the enemies of the Assyrians would naturally seize. A further spoiling of the fugitives probably followed, and the prestige of the great king was gone. Marauding bands would probably on all sides ravage the Assyrian territory. So Sennacherib loses 185,000 soldiers. He retreats to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. But because of the weakened state of his army now, what's going to happen? All of these other nations are going to start attacking him. And so you have a continual looting of the nations of Assyria by the nations. And the running to and fro of locusts. So like the running about of the swarms of locusts, men would run to collect and greedily carry away the spoil of the Assyrians, their enemies. So it was a very deliberate an attack upon the Assyrians as to they've taken all this spoil from them. They're going to take it back now, and anything else that they could get.
They'll probably run up in the hillside and everywhere they can go to maybe at least save their life, possibly. Wedging rock cracks and everywhere.
You're talking about the Assyrians running?
Assyrians and anybody that was scared would probably do that. You get out of Dodge, you do anything possible.
Well, that's the Assyrians who are trying to leave. So they're going to, in all probability, because nothing is said, they were an army. They would retreat together. They would not scatter so much, but the problem is they've lost so many men now that others could come and attack them and take a lot of the things which they had taken. But in all probability, the Assyrian army retreated to Nineveh as a whole. Because even though they were in a weakened state, they didn't have the number of soldiers that they did previously, there's still that old statement, there's strength in numbers. So they would stay together. In verse 5 then, and here's where we start getting into the reason I titled this section a prayer of praise for what God will do. In verse 5 he says, "The Lord is exalted, for he dwelleth on high. He hath filled Zion with judgment and righteousness." So God is exalted by the Assyrians' destruction. Someone read Exodus chapter 15, verses 14 through 16. Exodus 15, 14 through 16. Okay. This is describing when Israel is going to be going to the promised land. And it's not so much that, but notice sorrow taking hold of the inhabitants of Palestine. The dukes of Edom amazed, mighty men of Moab trembling, the inhabitants of Canaan melting away, fear and dread falling upon them. Why? Because of the greatness of God. He is being exalted as they are traveling to Palestine and taking that area, that whole promised land. Turn over to the 96th Psalm. And we want to read verses 3 through verse 10. Psalm 96, 3 through 10. He says, Declare his glory among the heathen, his wonders among all people. For the Lord is great, and greatly to be praised. He is to be feared above all gods. For all the gods of the nations are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. Honor and majesty are before him. Strength and beauty are in his sanctuary. Give unto the Lord, O ye kindreds of the people. Give unto the Lord glory and strength. Give unto the Lord the glory due unto his name. Bring an offering and come into his courts. O worship the Lord in beauty and holiness. Fear before him all the earth. Say among the heathen that the Lord reigneth. The world also shall be established, that it shall not be moved. He shall judge the people righteously. What a great description of the exaltation of God. He is great, greatly to be praised. His exaltation. And even among the nations, you see that exaltation. That the nations, their gods are idols, but the Lord made heavens. And so honor and majesty are before him. So the Lord is exalted. Notice that it does not state, though, and this would be true in the passage in Exodus. It's true in the 96th Psalm that we read, that he becomes exalted. Doesn't say that. His exaltation is constant. It has always been. The people might not recognize it, and they might come to recognize his glory and his exaltation, but the Lord has always been that way. He has always been exalted. And so he doesn't become such, he is such. And always has been, always will be. It's our duty, you might say, to recognize his greatness, his exaltation, and to live in harmony thus with that. It's also our duty to get others to recognize that greatness of God. And I think that's one of the great problems we see in our society. We don't, as a whole, our nation does not see the greatness of God. They have basically excluded him. But he is the one who is still in control. Now, I don't know Hebrew, but from those that do, and I understand the concept. Again, English is quite different than whether you're talking about Hebrew or Greek. I know with Greek that this is true. Told that Hebrew, it's the same way. That you would put a word that you want emphasized first. You know, our sentences is a subject, verb, and then direct object, basically. The subject comes first. In Greek, I know, doesn't matter where the subject is. The word exalted here is the first word in this verse. Isaiah is emphasizing the fact that God is exalted. Again, our English doesn't do that. It doesn't work that way. But I know Greek it does. And then the subject can come someplace later on. But here, exalted first, because that's the emphasis. He is the one who is ruling. He is the controller of the world. Even today, with all of the wickedness in our society and the world over, God is still the one who's in control. One of the great lessons of the book of Daniel is that very lesson. God's the one in control. He raises up kings. He takes kings away as it pleases him. And you might remember when Nebuchadnezzar goes out and he starts looking at all of the glory and how great he is. You remember what happened to him? He became basically like an animal. Started eating grass until he learned what? God is in control.
That most high ruler of the kingdoms of men
Okay.
gives it to whoever he wills.
Okay, that's the language of Daniel. The Most High ruleth in the kingdoms of men and giveth it to whomsoever he will. Question, does God do that today? Through his providence, he does. And I'm using providence there maybe in not the way we would normally use it, but he's the one who's in control still. I'll set this forth. It's not something that I believe, but I know a lot of brethren through the years have held the view that a Christian should not vote because God's in control. And, well, you can go back and tell, I think it was David Lipscomb for one, how stupid he was. I say, I don't agree with the view, but I know many brethren in the past have believed that. Christians should not vote. Why? Because God's the one in control. If you want to affect the outcome, pray. That's what they would say. Not vote. That's what I would argue, that that's the way in which God is working it out, is that we go out and vote. But the principle behind it, their thoughts, God is in control, is absolutely right. And if you wanted to go a little bit farther with their thinking, again, it's not my views, but trying to be honest with them, they would say if you vote, you might be voting against God's will. Have you ever thought about that? Maybe it's God's will that this candidate wins and you're voting for this candidate instead. Am I voting then against God's will? Again, I don't agree with the conclusions. I'm just saying that some brethren, because of their views that God is in control of these things, they thus would not even vote, would not engage in that process. I respect their views dealing with God is in control. But and don't do anything, what good is it? And that's how I would argue along those lines, or part of the arguments. But I'm just saying the principle that God is in control, they are correct about that. I may not understand it. If you want to get into trouble, and I don't want to get into this discussion this evening, but I will present it to you. Was God in control when Hitler became, in control of Nazi Germany? I don't understand all of it, but he's in control. What? Well, yes, you should pray that you vote right. And that would certainly include voting according to God's principles, and the principles that he has set down within his word as to what's right, what's wrong, what government's responsibility and obligations are, and who's going to fulfill those obligations. So it would include all of those things. There have been many through the years who have argued that yes, Nazi Germany was punishing the Jews, but you could extend it. Was Nazi Germany also the instrument of God's punishment of Europe? That's why I say expanding it to all of Europe. Now then the question, Sennacherib and the Assyrian army, were they wicked? Absolutely. In many respects, far more wicked than many of the nations that they destroyed. Study Habakkuk sometime, because that's Habakkuk's great question. How can God allow, in this case, the Babylonians, to destroy a nation that is not as wicked as they are? And in reality, God is saying, I'm using the Babylonians to do this. Now then, there's some of the principles. The applications I'll leave up to you. But God is always in control. And that's what Isaiah is saying here. He's the ruler. He's the king. His dwelling place is, yes, on high. It's in the heavens. But God's still in control of what happens here. Assyria had conquered many gods or countries, casting them down. Assyria thought Yahweh was just like all of these idols that they had already defeated and cast down. But in reality, He's different. And in overthrowing the Assyrians, it demonstrates, it shows His exaltation. So the destruction of Assyria is in a part a result of the Israelites turning to God, putting away their iniquity, and establishing justice and righteousness in the land. Someone read Isaiah 1 and verse 26. The city of righteousness. They were turning to God, establishing righteousness in the land, and thus God's destruction of Assyria. God was also demonstrating these qualities in what He was doing. Look at Isaiah 32 and verse 16. Then judgment shall dwell in the wilderness, and righteousness remain in the fruitful field. God establishing those things. Look at the 89th Psalm in verse 14, where He says, justice and judgment are the habitation of Thy throne. Mercy and truth shall go before Thy face. So, that's the nature of God Himself. Being His nature, when they turn to Him in those ways, He's going to thus deliver them. And in doing so, He is demonstrating His righteousness and His justice. One more passage in the 97th Psalm in verse 2. Where it says, clouds and darkness are round about Him. Righteousness and judgment are the habitation of His throne. So, righteousness and judgment, that's the dwelling place of God's throne. Everything about Him is righteous. Everything is just. We may not always understand everything, but we can always be assured that God is working in righteousness. Give an illustration, when God reveals to Abraham, I'm going to destroy Sodom, Gomorrah, and these 5 cities of the plain. Did Abraham understand that? In fact, didn't Abraham instead say, question, shall not the God of all the earth do right? Why? Because Abraham thought that it would be wrong in what God was doing. Now why? Because Abraham's concept was God is going to destroy the righteous with the wicked. And so he asked God, shall not the God of all the earth do right? If there's 50 righteous souls, will you spare the cities? Yes. 45, 40, 30, 20, 10, and so forth. Yes, I'll spare the city for 10 righteous souls. Why? Because God will always do right. always wondered about that aspect as to Abraham continuing to go down, because he obviously, and my thought is, why didn't he just start out with 10, for one thing? There weren't that many. And, I don't guess there's any way to determine how many people lived in that area. But the estimates are that there were millions. So think of, let's just say 1 million people who lived in Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain. And not 10 people could be found that were righteous. And thus God destroyed them. Yeah. And Genesis 6, 7, and 8. The world was so wicked that the thought of man's heart was only evil continually. So what does God do? He destroys the world with the flood. He saves Noah and his family, 8 souls, saved by water. Because why? They were righteous. God always will punish the wicked. He will save the righteous. And that should be comforting for us to know that if we are righteous, if we live a righteous life as defined by God, not as defined by denominations or the world or anyone or any individual, but as defined by God, that God will save that individual. And isn't that to a great extent what Paul is talking about in 2 Thessalonians 1? To you who are afflicted, rest with us. So those who suffer because of righteousness, you can rest because God's going to afflict them. God's going to destroy them. And Jude even, I think it's Jude, it's always difficult, 2 Peter 2 or Jude, where it talks about Lot, and they vexed his righteous soul day by day. That would have been a difficult way to live, wouldn't it? Every day, those wicked men vexing his soul, his righteous soul. He remained righteous in spite of the fact that every day he was faced with that wickedness. Know what that tells me? That in face of the wickedness that we see in our society, I can live faithful. So can you. So can anyone. We will be vexed with the unrighteousness of the people, but we can still live righteous. And that's a comforting thought. And then to know that God will thus save those who live righteous. We will start then at verse 6, Lord willing, next time.